Alright, so we're just about ready to collapse all of our nodes down and create our final character asset. Before we do that, there's a couple of things I want to do to clean up our network as it stands. There's a few things I need to do down inside of chops to stop us from getting errors when we collapse this into an asset. There's also a couple of nodes that I feel need a few additional parameters added so that when you select those control objects, we get a couple of extra parameters added in terms of auto-scoped parameters. So let's start by cleaning up our chops. So I'm going to first start with our belly chops since we're there, jump inside, and on all of these different chops I need to remove that export prefix. So I'm going to select all of our chops and remove the export prefix of /obj. Let's make sure that did indeed take on all of our chops, and it did. Fantastic. Jump back up. The other chop network we need to deal with is our kin chops. So I want to jump into our kin chops network. Let's select everybody. On the common tab, delete the export prefix obj. Let's just randomly grab a couple to make sure that did indeed take, and it looks like it did. I also want to make sure that all of the references to various things on our inverse kinematics chops are set up in relative paths as opposed to absolute paths. Now when we set these up using our tool, they are indeed created using relative paths. However, when we mirrored our rig back in the end of character rigging 1, the paths would have been set up and they wouldn't have been set up using relative paths because of the way that the mirror tool works. So we can see that indeed all the left hand side have relative paths, but our right hand side are actually going to have absolute paths. This is very easy to fix. We can simply grab this and make sure we have export relative path selected. Notice it automatically takes us to that node. If we now click accept, it converts that into a relative path. I can now bring up the browser, click accept, bring up the browser, click accept, and that's going to convert all these into relative paths. So I'm just going to work my way down all of these parameters for our right nodes. Now of course our rename and our null, they won't have any on them, but the inverse kin chops, I am going to run down all their parameters and convert them into relative paths. So just bringing up the browser with export relative path checked, we're just clicking on the accept button and that's converting them to relative paths. So just a few more to do. And that's all of the right hand side ones, except for our foot. So let's get our foot set up. Done. And of course, if you didn't follow along with character rigging 1, you won't have any of these to deal with. You also need to remove the export prefix of /obj. You'll also need to deal with, I believe the belly will need to have it changed because we use the built-in kinematics when we use the bones tool as opposed to relying on one of our tools, whereas our tool will set them up, usually set them up using relative as opposed to absolute. Here in this case these are set up because again it was created using the tool, the bones from curve tool as opposed to our own tool. This is absolute, so we want to convert these to relative and the curve object. Neck kinematics, again relative paths. And finally our belly kinematics, we want to make sure these are all relative paths. And that's just going to stop us getting issues with the fact that we're using absolute paths. Of course we want them all relative because they need to be internal to our asset. Now there are a few parameters I want to add as auto-scope parameters on our controls. There are some parameters that are on nodes that whilst they are animatable, we're not going to set them, or I'm personally not going to set them as auto-scope parameters. An example of that is the spine stretchiness that exists on our master control. I don't think that having spine stretchiness auto-scope when we select the master control makes much sense. Yes, it will be promoted to our asset, and it will be promoted to our asset in such a way that it will relate then to our spine. The only reason we put it on the master control was there wasn't really anywhere else that logically made sense to put it. So having it on the master control even then doesn't make all that much sense, so I don't want to have that auto-scope. There are a few other parameters like that about the network that I am going to skip on. However, there are some parameters I do want to auto-scope. Now, all the translates and rotates, etc., they do all auto-scope for us successfully anyway, and any locked parameters will not be auto-scoped. On our fingers control, we have that spread parameter. I want to right click, go down to channels and keyframes, and I want to set the auto scope on the spread parameter for our fingers control on both the left and the right hand side of our network. So I'm going to right click on the spread parameter, channels and keyframes, set auto scope. We also have our shoulder controls. Let's hunt down our shoulder controls. I want to auto scope the twist offset and the RX offset along with the translates and rotates. So I'm going to right click, channels and keyframes, set auto scope on both of those for both of our shoulder controls. We also have to do the same on our head controls. You're going to notice we also need to actually lock some parameters on our head controls. So we're going to lock everything except for the translates and rotates there. And then we can go ahead and set the twist offset as an auto-scoped parameter. So if you want to go through and maybe you will think that there are parameters that you want to have auto-scoped when we select something. Another good example of this would be if we select that super risk control. For those of you who followed along in character rigging 1, we do have the attach to detach blend for our risk controls available as a parameter. You may want to have that auto-scoped when the animator selects the risk control. I personally don't want to have that auto-scoped. I believe that really that's something that gets linked in very tightly to our match attach to detach and detach to attach buttons, and I believe it's much better off being at the asset level and not really being an auto-scoped parameter. But it's all up to you guys, and also I guess up to the animators in a production situation. If they come back and say, hey, it would be really cool if you had that auto-scoped, it'd be very, very easy to come in and auto-scope that for them. So with that, that is going to clean up all of our network ready to create an asset, and the next series of videos are going to focus on creating our final character asset. So that is going to conclude this video. Thanks a lot, everyone.